Good afternoon, everyone. Zach Lucas McCarthy Denning, just bringing us in a bit early on this webinar dealing with India and Indonesia, part of the Governance and Succession series that we've been running over the last week or so. So for today's session, obviously we're doing India and Indonesia, but I just want to remind everyone of the program generally. So next week at the same time, we'll be doing Philippines and Japan, and then take a break for a week, and then come back with a double header with Malaysia and Thailand, and then finally winding up the entire series with the special session on the single family office. And in that, we are looking at bringing in a comparison between an ordinary use of a Singapore PT company and comparing it with a VCC, and seeing whether or not there are any particular advantages on using either in terms of structuring for business families, as well as generally for wealthy ultra high net worth families that are looking at establishing single family offices in Singapore. As I said, next week will be Philippines and Japan, and I've put a link on the chat for today where you can go to that if you haven't already registered, and then use that for the purpose of registration. So coming back to today's session, we'll be joined by Spencer Stewart, Deputy Director of Monetary Authority of Singapore, Priya Rao, Partner, AZB Partners in India, and Freddie Kriadi, Partner, ABNR in Jakarta, Indonesia. I'm very grateful for these practitioners for spending time on these webinars. I just say at the beginning as normal admonition that the purpose of these webinars is not for technical legal advice. This is just general views on assumed facts, and therefore should not be relied upon as if it were technical legal advice being given. For today's agenda, business family demographics will be the first that we deal with, and then we'll move on to succession planning. And in here, we're looking principally at what the business families do in India and Indonesia when it comes to their business succession planning. We'll look at governance planning as a separate subtopic of this. And then we'll go on to look at the international structuring and whether or not it's possible for an international structure to be used as part of the succession planning domestically for Indian and Indonesian families. We'll then look at the emergence of domestic family offices in each market and see whether or not this is actually happening. And if it is, how is it manifesting? And we'll ask our panelists to help us with understanding what the dynamics look like within the domestic scene. And then we'll end with the international family office. And here we're looking principally at the Singapore single family office. But we're looking at it in the context of, Spencer will take us through obviously the main characteristics of this and its success story. But then we'll transition to look at how can the Singapore single family office slot in the sort of ecosystem for each of India and Indonesia, and what are the challenges. So that's today's program. Should be on time in terms of an hour, and then we'll have some time at the end for some question and answers. And as usual, the recording as well as the slides will be made available after the session is complete. So looking at the family demographics, and the questions I'll ask here of the panelists is, which generation is typically in control for their relevant jurisdiction, the average number of family members that will succeed to the business, and how soon do we anticipate succession will occur? Within 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, how urgent is this? So I would ask Shreya to open us up with which generation is typically in control with respect to the sort of Indian business families. Is it first generation, second, third? Where are we at the moment in India?
Sure. Thanks, Zach. So I think there's a wide variance in India, to be honest, because it is a large country and it's also gone through economic liberalization only about 20, 30 years ago. So what I would like to start with is the oldest businesses that you would typically see will generally be in the range of 60 to 70 years. And the reason for this is that prior to 1947, the British were ruling India, and there used to be restrictions on ownership of businesses and expropriatory taxation, for example. So most of the oldest businesses in India are run by the Parsi community, who maintained more neutral relationships with the British. And examples would be the Tata Group, which was founded in 1868, and the Wadia Group, which was founded in 1879. Parry & Co. is another very, very old business that was founded by a Welshman in the late 1800s and is now under Indian ownership. But with these few exceptions, most Indian businesses that you will see today, which are fairly big, would have been set up post-independence. And several would have also been set up post the 90s. So most of the technology businesses that you hear about are fairly young and therefore haven't had the chance to move to the next generation yet. So 2 generations in most cases, and some of the larger ones will even be 1 generation.
Right, and the average number of family members that will succeed to the business, how big is the problem? Because obviously the more members that succeed, the more complex it is to coordinate everyone.
I think it would again depend on the nature of the business. So for the more old school businesses, you are probably looking at, I don't know, maybe 10 or 15 members in the next generation at the most. You would definitely not be looking at numbers in excess of that. But it is also common to have businesses which have far fewer stakeholders, which would depend on the size of the families involved.
Right, right. And then in terms of the succession process, I've got listed there 3, 5, 10 years. What do we see as the time frame within which we will principally hand off to the next generation? How urgent has this become?
So several of these businesses which are in the second generation have patriarchs or people running the business who are in their 60s and 70s. So I would say that the transition to the third generation would happen within the next 10 years or so.
Next 10 years, right, right. And Freddie, from your perspective, which generation is typically in control of Indonesian family businesses? Are we at second generation yet, or are we still at the founder generation?
Okay, thank you, Zach. Yes, I think in Indonesia, currently mostly second generation in control. The first generation already maybe very old, 90 or above if they still alive. But now in control is the second generation, which is maybe they were born is like 1945 or 1950. Right. So basically that's the situation.
Right. And the average number of family members that are likely to succeed, how many people do you think on average are going to be in the next generation that enter the business?
Maybe the average number is like 4 to 6, depend on, of course, depend on which family and the industry. But I think 4 to 6, quite the fair range to be mentioned.
Right, right. And the time frame within which we anticipate that the families will actually go through the succession process. I realize that it's, sort of second generations, but how are they, so when do we think that this great transfer is going to happen?
Yeah, maybe to mention about time frame, maybe a bit hard because indeed the succession, the gradual succession may already happen, but if we can talk about the time frame, I could say that maybe the 10 years is the ultimate timeline, meaning that maybe after the 10 years, the second generation will fade away from the control.
Right, right, okay. And in terms of the succession planning, these are the principal questions I'd run through. Do families typically transfer the business on death or during lifetime? Do families typically structure succession by use of a trust or other sort of arrangement to effectively delay the transfer? Or are there any community property or was there clawback concerns in the market? And again, Ashri, I'll ask you to run through. Do the families typically transfer businesses on death or during the lifetime? What do we typically see?
So, Zach, I think it would be helpful to start off with a broad framework here, which is that succession law in India is community specific and religion specific. So the choices that families adopt will depend quite significantly on which community or religion they belong to. So for example, most communities in India do not have forced heirship principles or a system of community property, but Muslims in India who are governed by Sharia law do. And so there will be a preference amongst Muslims in India to execute lifetime transfers, either by way of gifts or by settling a trust, for instance. And similarly, with Hindus, there is a concept called the Hindu undivided family, which is a system of community ownership that operates at the family level instead of as at the couple level. And historically, what used to happen is that most people would never write wills because the property was jointly held within the system of the Hindu undivided family, and it would simply pass to the next generation in that manner. Having said this, in the last 5 to 10 years or so, one significant development is that there is talk of an estate tax or an inheritance tax being introduced in India. We don't have one at this point in time, but several families have started planning and putting in place lifetime bequests or trusts in anticipation of an estate tax coming in. In terms of numbers, this will not be significant, but it is an idea that is getting traction as the years pass. And there is fully the expectation that an estate tax will come in at some point in the future, which is compelling people to look at lifetime transfers more seriously. And there, of course, trusts would become very critical as well.
And in terms of trusts in India, have you modernized your trustee act as many of the Commonwealth countries have done, or do you feel that the current trust provisions are sufficient to handle something like a business being put into trust?
We still rely on the trust legislation that the British put in place in the late 1800s. Having said this, trusts per se tend to be quite flexible as vehicles. So even if the legislation is really lacking, you end up working in a lot of these provisions into your trust deed. And so it isn't uncommon in the Indian context to see protectorship structures, private trust companies, and so on. Having said that, I do think there is a lot of scope for a newer legislation to bring in clarity on critical issues. So, for example, we don't have legislation today that deals with settler reserve powers. And Indian promoters love retaining control over their trust structures. So it's quite common to see provisions where they retain extensive powers. And we don't know how those will be treated by an Indian court. Similarly, when trusts hold family businesses, you may sometimes see anti-Bartlett provisions being included, and we don't know how those would be treated by an Indian court. We are yet to see a case on the validity of protectorship structures or private trust companies. And although there have been cases which have referred to them in passing, we don't have any jurisprudence on their validity so far. So I think all of these are issues that as institutional trustee structures become more common and as trusts start being used more actively in the planning process, we will see some clarity on in the years going forward, but we don't have it at this point in time.
Right, and in terms of the domestic India market, is there the establishment of a professional trustee class? So do you have sort of licensed trust companies or sort of professional trust companies being involved in this, or is it still trusteeships in a personal capacity? How is it generally evolving?
It's a mix of both. You don't require a license to be a trustee company in India, but you do have the concept of institutional trustees picking up traction, particularly over the last 5 or 10 years or so. There again, I think it's an evolving process, and their levels of sophistication are constantly improving as well. But this is again a point on which we will look to other countries to see examples of the sort of best practices that we should adopt and the sorts of issues that we should watch out for.
Right. And you mentioned earlier in terms of the undivided property. So presumably there isn't going to be much sort of use of trust structures if they want to do the transfer through this undivided property route. Is that right? Or would that give rise to a clawback claim if they try to do it outside of the sort of undivided regime?
So there are two questions there. One is whether trusts still have utility, considering that Hindus already have this undivided property construct. And the second is if they do decide to set up trusts, whether there's a potential clawback.
Yes.
So on the first question, I think there is absolutely utility. And the reason for that is that the Hindu undivided family construct is driven by customary law. And it may not give you the flexibility that you're looking for in terms of how the property is managed, how milestone distributions are made, how you limit the power of certain people to participate in the property or limit exits, for instance. So for example, until 2005, daughters were not considered co-parceners in this Hindu undivided family. And that was modified by a Supreme Court ruling and subsequent legislation. So prior to that, if you wanted to give your daughters an equal share in this property, you would have to set up something similar to a trust. So you can think of the Hindu undivided family as a sort of discretionary trust where the karta, who is the manager, has very broad discretionary powers, but it will not give you the kind of flexibility that a private trust could potentially. On your second question on clawbacks, you're right that if it's considered ancestral property, there will be limitations on your ability to put that property into trust. And the way families typically do it is after the property is partitioned, it would then be construed as individual property in the hands of the person who receives it after partition. And then, of course, they do have the flexibility to put it into a trust structure.
Right, right. I mean, and so, but there's no special regime for, presumably, it's going to be company shares that are being transferred, right? So there's no special regime for a business family company. It's just seen as any other type of property.
Absolutely. It's like any other kind of property.
Right, got it. Okay. Okay, so Freddie, just from your perspective in terms of the sort of Indonesian families, typically transfer the business on death or during lifetime. And what arrangements can we use in Indonesia? Obviously, domestic trusts are not available under your laws, but are there any other arrangements that the families try to use to sort of control and delay the absolute transfer of the business across? And then community property and forced heir claims, particularly the surviving spouse, does she have rights to the business, to participate in the ownership of the business? So these are just the general sort of points on this from an Indonesian perspective.
Okay, thank you. So I think to answer the point or bullet point number one, that typically family transfer during the lifetime because they don't want to have an unexpected or unorganized distribution. So the second generation normally they already transfer not only the business but also the knowledge. Teach the third generation how to run the business, tips and tricks, and how to manage the business in short. So how they want to prepare properly. So during the lifetime, of course, that's typically family transfer the business.
Right.
Bullet point number one.
Yes. And so because they transfer it, absolutely, do they give a small amount of shares and then introduce the third generation in a sort of like an internship in the business, and then later then transfer more shares as they're more happy that the next generation are going to work together correctly?
Yes, you are correct. That's they normally the way to make it the candidate of the certain, let's say the certain business unit. Let's say they have like 4 A, B, C, and D, the third generation. So let's say A is dedicated for the, let's say, line of business or unit business number 1. So yes, A will have a bit shares in the business unit number 1, but the second generation still control mostly, and the gradual transfer of knowledge and so on. And then the third generation become, let's say, like one of the director. The second generation sit in the chairman, so can still watch the operation.
Yeah.
And then normally they will also have like a cross-holding, meaning that although the children number 1 control the business unit A, but children 2, 3, and 4 may have a bit shares in the number 1.
Mm.
So, and then for the number 2, 3, and 4 will have the same structure, will have the same cross-holding. So they still want to create the bond among the family members. So if they have, let's say, like a shareholders meeting or family meeting, they still have the same feeling, the same the sharing the strategy. Because normally the business A, B, C, D for the children 1 to 4 will still have intercompany transaction, intercompany support. So they want to have the bond stronger and stronger.
Right. And how long do they do this sort of shadowing? How typically long is it? 10 years that they introduce them in, or is it 5 years, or how long is the internship basically?
I think the internship normally would be around 8 to 10 years.
Really? Right, right, okay. And how do we deal with a situation where if they gift the shares to particular next generation, if they infringe any community property or any forced heir rights for the surviving spouse, how do we deal with that situation in practice?
Yeah, because we don't have the trust, as you mentioned earlier. So understand that the potential distribution ratio may breach the force here or community property barrier. But normally people or the third generation will discuss amicably, or they will have a cash settlement.
Right.
That the one who already appointed as a controller for business A, for instance, still continue, but because maybe A has a very big value compared to B, C, D, so maybe A will compensate others by giving up the cash.
So they come to some agreement beforehand, before there's a dispute later on down the road. Is that basically?
Yes.
Right.
Yes. That's the amicable discussion between or among the members.
Right, right, okay. In terms of the sort of governance planning itself, do families spend time creating specific governance frameworks to help the next generation work together? Do families take into account best practice corporate governance codes? And these are typically expressed in the corporate governance codes in the relevant sort of country stock exchanges. Are governance controls typically contained in a shareholders agreement, corporate constitution, or where relevant, a trust? And these are the three main points on governance. So again, I'd ask you to kick us off. Do families spend time creating specific frameworks for the next generation to actually work together?
It's happening slowly but surely. There are some families which have put in place fairly detailed governance structures, either in terms of a family charter or a family board or council. But it isn't something that you see across the board. I think the levels of sophistication are improving, and you'll likely see more of it over the coming years. But as of today, there are some noteworthy examples of families who've done this.
Right. And in terms of where the families have done this, do they typically look to what the corporate corporate codes of conduct or the corporate governance codes are saying? So I know that India has quite an advanced corporate governance code for its stock exchange. Do the families look at that as a potential source of how best to structure their companies for transparency, for managing conflicts of interest, and for control within the generation? Have you seen that sort of referencing to the corporate governance codes as a sort of principled approach for the families to lead them on this sort of journey?
So typically, Zach, corporate governance codes are referred to if the family anticipates a future exit or if they plan to get an external institutional investor in at some point, for instance. But what you need to keep in mind is that the vast majority of Indian businesses continue to be family owned and foresee themselves as being family owned in the long term. So when these kinds of succession exercises are put in place, or governance frameworks are put in place, it is done primarily from a succession standpoint rather than a governance standpoint. So they will, for instance, deal with issues of how somebody exits, how you resolve disputes within the family, how people share an economic interest, and so on and so forth. So how to professionalize and how to bring in good governance practices may be something that they deal with in an ancillary manner, but in most situations, it wouldn't really form the focus of the planning exercise.
Right. So presumably they're not entering into complex shareholder arrangements or amending their constitutions, their corporate constitutions, if they're dealing with this as a family more than as a operational legal matter. Is that correct?
Not necessarily, because the way in which families plan for succession is vastly different. Some of them do prefer to have shareholders' agreements to document the intra-family understanding because they want something enforceable between two family branches which hold shares, for instance. Other families may well prefer a softer document like a family constitution rather than doing a shareholders' agreement. But it's broadly fairly variable, and it would depend on what the family wants to accomplish. But the short point is that this exercise will typically be driven by considerations of intergenerational wealth transfer and how to preserve the value in the business, rather than the question of how to bring in governance best practices into the business.
Right, right. So they haven't got to the point where this is a central theme in the planning. It's more about how to transition ownership across generations.
That's correct. With one exception that I should highlight, which is that we've had an insolvency and bankruptcy code put in place a couple of years ago, which is a creditor favorable legislation, which has compelled a lot of families to separate their personal and business assets. So historically, what used to happen is that, as with many family businesses, families would put in everything they made into the business. And often personal expenses would be defrayed from the business as well. But now, because of this creditor favorable legislation, families have started thinking consciously about setting aside their nest egg and their personal wealth, which is a good governance practice that has become common in the recent past, and which has also led to the growth of interest in family offices in India.
Right, right. Okay, I mean, in terms of Freddie, so looking at a typical Indonesian family when they're arranging how the next generation will work together, when they look at things like who will be directors, how will they, so how will they all agree the directors' salaries, how will they share information about the business going forward? The basic governance mechanisms that you would expect to see where a new team is taking over the business. How do they typically do that? Do they do that in shareholder agreement or corporate constitutions, or how do they tend to express that, if at all?
Okay, thank you. So basically, the shareholders agreement is quite common, although not very complicated if this is a family business. In the shareholders agreement, we'll have the typical provision in the shareholders agreement on like you mentioned, the compensation, the seat of directors, and so on and so forth. Although this is not sophisticated like a joint venture for foreign local JV company. That's for the number one. For the best practice corporate governance, generally yes, they have a quite good corporate governance code among the family, although maybe that's a general understanding, but although some exception in certain points.
Right.
And then on the governance control typically contained in shareholders agreement, corporate constitution or trust. I think yes. Generally in the shareholders agreement, they mention the way who control the operation to make it we have the leader for this particular business at least. So to make it, if you have more than one control, more than one leader, that make it coordination more difficult. So yes, the answer is yes for this bullet point number 3.
Right. And just one thing for both of you in terms of the minority shareholder protections. I think, Shreya, from your perspective, how robust is the Indian Corporates Code in protecting minority shareholders broadly? Is it very protective, or is it very, very loose in terms of its protective measures? Shreya, are you still with us?
Sorry, I missed that. Could you just repeat that, Zach?
Yeah, I was just talking about the, just broadly, what, in terms of the corporate law in India, is it very protective of minority shareholder rights, or is it pretty liberal in terms of allowing the majority to do pretty much what they want?
So our minority shareholder legislation again has, it derives from the original British legislation with some departures. So yes, minority shareholders do have rights. Although in practice, what happens is that with family businesses, they do hold majority control, and we don't see a lot of instances of oppression and mismanagement being alleged, but they do have rights under law.
Right, right. In fact, in terms of Indonesian law, are minority shareholders protected? I'm thinking about this situation where you have, let's say, 5 members in the 3rd generation, and you've got, let's say, 4 of those members start to pick on or abuse the 5th member's rights under the sort of constitution and corporate laws. Is there much protection for that minority shareholder?
I think if we rely on minority protection on the articles of association of the company,
yeah,
the company law, I think that the protection is not really much.
right.
Although there are quite important protections there,
Yeah,
but not really much. So to beef up the minority protection, normally people will enter into the shareholders agreement to give certain rights like specific matters, reserve matters,
right.
certain seats, exit strategy, and so on and so forth. So
Right.
that's the situation, I believe.
Okay. Okay. In terms of family constitutions, are family charters and constitutions actually popular with the families in your respective jurisdictions? Do they have any legal implications? And who typically prepares family constitutions if they are used in your jurisdiction? Is it lawyers, accountants, finance professionals, or business school academics? So, Shreya, if you could take us through that.
Sure. So they are picking up traction. They're not, like I said, you don't see them as being commonplace, but families are becoming increasingly interested in them. Whether they have legal implications or not would depend on how rigid or how enforceable the family wants to make them.
Yeah.
In some situations, as I mentioned, families prefer enforceable structures because they want to avoid disputes taking place at some point in the future. So in that case, what they will do is they will bind a trustee with the family constitution, and they will say that a trust should take all decisions in accordance with the constitution. But there are also equally enough examples of families using the family constitution as a vision statement and as a value statement of sorts, in which case it functions as less of an enforceable contract and just a sort of guiding principle for family discussions in the future. So whether they have legal implications or not would depend on how the families put them in place. And it would also accordingly influence who drafts them. So if you want to do this as a vision statement, for instance, you may be more happy to employ a business school academic to help you with those conversations. Whereas if you want it to be more legally enforceable, you would more likely employ a lawyer. Having said this, I should emphasize that the way the constitution process works in India, and as I understand this is also true of some other countries, is that it would typically involve two stages. One is the psychological stage or the mediation stage, where the family needs to sit together and come to a consensus on what they want to do. And that stage is more likely to be handled either by a non-lawyer or by a senior lawyer who has a relationship with the family. Whereas when they come to the second stage, which is the actual nuts and bolts of documenting what they have agreed to, that's where a lawyer or an accountant is more likely to come in.
Right, right. Freddie, in your perspective from Indonesia, are we seeing more family constitutions being adopted? And if they are, how would they have any legal implications under Indonesian law if there was ever a family dispute or a shareholder dispute? And then typically who are preparing these documents? Business academics or lawyers and professionals?
Okay, thank you. I don't think the family charter or constitution popular in Indonesia. We normally just have a serious agreement, or if among the family member that to govern object more than just a company, so maybe a group or something. That's not so popular or not so common to have this type of document actually. So normally the way of thinking of the second generation will decide on how to distribute and how to run the group.
Right, right.
So that's for number one. And number two, if I think on number three, if there is, I believe normally, of course, lawyers or maybe the notary will help to contemplate, but I don't think popular at this moment.
Right, right. Okay, okay. All right, now just transitioning. International structuring, and here it's very sort of brief questions. Is it possible to structure succession to a family business using an offshore entity or arrangement? And what are the main considerations if this is possible? So I'd ask you to lead us off. Is it possible for the international financial centers such as Singapore to get involved in a domestic Indian succession plan for a domestic Indian business?
So Zach, here it would depend on the Indian exchange control regulations, which govern quite significantly the manner in which the ownership of Indian businesses can be transferred to an offshore entity, or the ownership of offshore assets can be acquired by Indian residents. So as I understand what you're talking about when you're talking about structuring succession using an offshore entity arrangement, have ownership of Indian business transferred to the Singapore vehicle. And as per the exchange control regulations, there would be a fair number of limitations in terms of how that could be done. The least of which would not be that, if a resident transfers to a non-resident, there is a requirement that it happen at a minimum of the fair market value of the Indian share. And so in terms of cash flow, it ends up being quite large amount that often the issue come is that the exchange regulations frown upon what is called a round tripping structure, where an Indian resident holds interests in a Singapore entity, for instance, which in turn holds interests in an Indian business. And so I think that combination of regulations would make it difficult to use an offshore entity solely for the purposes of succession planning. Having said this, if it's a globally resident family which has family members across the world, and there is already some ownership held through this offshore vehicle, then of course it's absolutely an option and it would be considered.
Right, and in terms of the last comment on the internationally held, if we have a sort of Indian headquarters, but we've got global subsidiaries, is it possible for those subsidiaries to be structured, subject of course to where they're located, without there being necessarily a big Indian sort of impact on that? Is that what you're saying?
There may be challenges with that as well. So although an Indian company can set up subsidiaries in other countries, if you want these subsidiaries to be held through an offshore trust structure, what you would essentially need to do is have the Indian entity settle an offshore trust. And I think there could be regulatory challenges with that, partly because the Reserve Bank of India does not have crystallized positions on the treatment of Indian trusts or offshore trusts. So we would need to look at those structures fairly carefully to be able to figure out if it's workable or not.
Right.
And in most situations, you should assume that there would be challenges with it.
Right, understood. Okay. So, Freddie, from your perspective, we're looking at international structures holding what is otherwise a domestic Indonesian business. How easy is that to achieve with the regulatory environment? I know you have negative lists, but how easy is it to create PMAs and do that in Indonesia?
Okay, thank you. I think as most of the Indonesian business would focus on Indonesian's market. So an Indonesian's market and Indonesian business subject to the negative list as you mentioned. So the international structuring, although it is possible, although it is doable, but not really popular because of the negative list consideration.
Yeah.
Not only about the restriction, but also the many requirements to maintain the foreign ownership investment here in Indonesia. So the answer is possible, of course, but not popular.
Not popular, right? Okay. Moving on to the domestic sort of family office environment. Is there demand for domestic family offices in your relevant jurisdictions, and which is more prevalent? And here I'll just set out the multifamily office, investment offices, and single family office, and I'll just explain what I mean by these terms. So a multifamily office is effectively external asset managers who are involved in reinvesting or investing sort of clients' money. So it's a professional outfit that's been put together for commercial purposes that may have a number of different client families that they reinvest for. And this is typically what we would call a multifamily office. There's other ones where it literally means families coming together, but that's not the context in which I mean that. Investment offices is not really, it's a way in which an entrepreneur or a relatively young sort of high net worth individual will reinvest his own funds. And there's no intention of it being cross-generational at this point. It's probably too early. So that's what typically an investment office is. And then a single family office really means family, and that means multi-generational, and that means collective wealth from different family branches. So looking at it from a domestic standpoint, is there actual demand for domestic family offices in your jurisdiction? And I think, Shreya, for you, if you can again take us forward with this.
Sure. So I think there is a mix of all three, and this has particularly become more popular, like I said, after the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code, which is a creditor favorable legislation that has compelled families to think about their personal investments in a more systematic manner. So multifamily offices, absolutely something that families are looking at, and you do have a couple of fairly successful multifamily offices in India. Investment offices tend to be more common amongst the younger entrepreneurs. So you see them occasionally with the technology entrepreneurs, for instance. And the larger families are also looking at single family office structures, although that tends to be more in relation to, so they would be less likely to focus only on the domestic side, and they would also look at international investments.
Right, right. And so, Freddie, from your perspective, looking at Indonesian families, is there demand for domestic family offices in Indonesia?
I think the demand are there, although maybe they're not really aware that they need the domestic family office. Because they manage by themselves, but I think the function of the family office, in this case is domestic, may give it to the family, can coordinate at least the focus of the investment and the roadmap of the investment. So although maybe not saying that the this is the statistic or the calculation of the demand, but understand that they start to professionally manage the investment and assets. So I think the domestic family office present will give advantage to them.
Right. And are you seeing many multi-family offices in Indonesia, in the sense of sort of professional external asset managers managing family wealth in Indonesia? Is that a growth area?
I think this multi-family investment office or single family office, I believe that the single family office would be the front runner, the more prevalent.
Right. We'll just transition there. And in terms of business families, obviously there comes a point in time where business families will begin to look at their international wealth. And what we've seen sort of over recent years is the internationalization of family offices and the use of financial centers in helping families to manage their concentrated wealth. And one particular success story in this area is the Singapore single family office. And this has been a recent sort of innovation that has grown quite rapidly over the years in terms of use. And I think at this point I would invite Spencer from the Monetary Authority of Singapore to make a few remarks about the single family office in Singapore. It's sort of where the originating idea and how it's been developed over the years and where it's going forward. So Spencer, if I could just hand over to you for a few comments on the International Family Office and particularly the Singapore Single Family Office.
Right, thanks very much, Zach, and also thanks to Shreya and Freddie for your very insightful. As I've mentioned earlier, you know, this is very educational for me as well in terms of my role in looking at the development of family businesses as well as family offices. So I think the point about international family offices actually extends very nicely from the earlier conversation on governance, succession planning, as well as how they manage their assets. And in the past few years, I think Singapore has been a key center for international family offices, because we see family offices that are coming from different parts of the world, including those from India as well as Indonesia. And I think some of the reasons why families would choose to set up an international family office, largely I think it's because families are becoming very cosmopolitan in nature. The family business may be in India or Indonesia, but the children are being educated outside of their home countries. And also subsequent to that, they may actually decide to either seek employment or to settle down in another part of the world, and that creates a very complex situation for the family in terms of managing its wealth. Do they manage it domestically? If that's the case, then when it comes to transferring to the next generation, how should they go about it? And I think another reason why international family offices tend to be attractive for families is that I think earlier on, we've talked about succession planning. How do you transfer the family business to the next generation? But I think there are also instances whereby in the cases of a large family, not all family members may wish to be directly involved in the family business. They may feel that there are other areas of pursuits that they are interested in, or that the younger members of the family need some time to be inducted into the family business. And hence this is where the family office comes as a useful entity or structure, because the family members will still be involved in managing the assets of the family without being directly involved in the management of the business itself. and the family office itself lends well for other functions which the family wishes to carry out. For example, I think a common area that we've seen, especially the more established families, is in terms of carrying out their philanthropy interests, or even, to carry out functions that are supportive of family governance, such as organizing, annual family board meetings, helping to set up the family constitution. This family office serves to be a very useful platform. And also, I think in terms of centralizing the assets for management, this is also very useful for families which have assets all over the world. I think, especially in light of the CRS reporting implementation, in order to optimize CRS reporting, instead of having to report via multiple jurisdictions, centralizing their assets under a single entity within a particular location actually simplifies the process of CRS reporting for the family. So I think for all these reasons that I've stated earlier, there are many benefits of international family office to family businesses, especially if they are rather global in nature. The focus of the business extends beyond the home country, and this in a way is helpful for them because it builds up their accumulation of offshore assets, and that's where the role of an international family office comes in useful. In this regard, Singapore has been an attractive location for families which are looking to set up their international family offices, particularly in the ASEAN region, because when families set up their family office, they want it to be close in terms of geographical proximity. And also between Singapore and India, I think, the travel distance is not too significant, not too obstructive. And I think in terms of cultural similarity, because of the common English spoken language, it's also a place whereby Indian business families are very comfortable in coming to. And hence, for these reasons, Singapore has been very attractive in that sense. And on top of that, I think in terms of Singapore's political and economic stability, the strong rule of law, all lends well to the protection of assets which are being managed out of Singapore. And at the same time, the ability to access global investment opportunities, including your top equities and bond listings, while at the same time being able to access private equity opportunities right in Singapore's backyard. I think that has proven to be a very useful combination of factors that has prompted many families to set up the international family offices in Singapore. And I think as a statistic to reflect this, the number of family offices that we have seen in Singapore has actually grown by 5 times in the period between 2017 to 2019. So this is actually a very strong growth story over here. And I think on top of that, there are also certain incentives that the Singapore government has put in place. There are some incentives which are meant to provide certainty and transparency of taxes for investments which are managed out of here. Those would, we would call this the 13X and the 13R tax incentives. And essentially what it means that for investments which are managed out of Singapore, the families can be assured that these investments, if they qualify under our list of qualified investments, will be tax exempted. And this will be for the perpetuity of the fund which is being managed out of Singapore. So it provides a very good certainty to family offices managing their assets from Singapore. And I think for those, for some of these business families as well, now is also a time whereby they are looking at where they want to establish their residency for the purpose of the future planning of the family, be it in terms of children's education, the family members' health care, as well as their taking care of their investment needs. So that for some families, they're actually looking at establishing their permanent residency in another location. And in this regard, Singapore also has some plans in place that can facilitate the application for permanent residency. Again, through the setup of a family office, if they were to meet the requirements, then it will be a fast track approach to obtaining a permanent residency in Singapore. And I think the beauty of the incentives is that, you know, they can be used in conjunction with each other to create the ideal kind of a setup for the families. I think I'll just pause here and see if there are any questions, be it from our panelists or even amongst the participants.
I've got questions. Freddie, from your perspective, the Singapore single family office, we're obviously out of the sort of amnesty holdover period. So are we seeing a lot of assets moving from Indonesia across back to Singapore to structure under these family offices? What have you seen sort of personally on this front?
Okay, so maybe when you mentioned about the tax amnesty, maybe in 2016, there were some return of offshore assets back to Indonesia, but not much. Mostly still stay offshore, mostly. So maybe to make a Singapore family office, there will be some assets put offshore. That's quite common, but this is normally for financial assets or maybe the property, meaning that the family would like to have the real property offshore. But on the active business, like I mentioned earlier, that maybe the negative list may be the main concern. The other is would be the CFC rules for the tax, meaning that we'll have maybe double tax, but cannot be remedied by tax treaty because CFC is the pure local issue.
Right. But you've not seen a sort of movement of assets that had come back as part of the amnesty being effectively sent out again for the purpose of reinvestment through Singapore, particularly. You've not seen that as a trend.
Yeah, at least compared to the whole nation, looks not so significant.
Right. So if it's going on with the wealth that was effectively in Singapore in any event.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I think for today's purposes, I would just like to sort of obviously thank Spencer and Freddie and obviously Shreya for spending time with us, and also for all of the attendees for sort of breaking their routine and spending time. I hope it's been a useful session. As I said, next week we will have the Philippines and Japan session being aired at the same time on Wednesday. So I think for the moment, I think we will close the session here today. Thanks very much for tuning in and listening, and we'll see you next week. Thank you all.
Thank you.